Hello, welcome to this IG Live episode, this inaugural episode of Akashic Creativity, which is a companion piece to my regular Monday show, Akashic Storytelling. So I'm taking a temporary break from that show in order to do this show because I'm launching my program, Akashic Creativity, in October. So welcome. So while I wait for people to show up, maybe I'll do a little dance, right? And maybe I will turn, yeah. There's a reason why I started this episode, this show with that dance, because I'll come back to it. And I'm doing a reading from The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Reed Renee Taylor. And it totally changed my perspective of my body. It took my self-love to a whole new other level of self-celebration, especially regarding the way I dance, especially with that spiral stick. So I'll come back to that, but I wanted to talk about how all of this applies to Akashic Creativity and the premise of this program, right, which is really about both reclaiming your joy, amplifying your clarity, and validating your value, increasing the value you give to the world, really increasing the impact you bring to the world. And as far as the impact piece and the value piece, it's about increasing your capacity for deep focus when you are doing a specific creative task. So, and this is a program for multi-passionate, multi-creative people. So I believe in something called slow motion multitasking, so multitasking. So that means that it's okay to have multiple interests. So that is not what I mean by a deep focus. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to be focused on one thing your entire life. I'm talking about when you are choosing to do a specific task, such as painting or singing or writing a song or a poem, then to increase your capacity to be deeply focused on that task without being without being distracted by social media, for example, without being distracted by a ping or a notification you get from your phone. By the way, I actually turned off all of my pings, all of my notifications on my phones, even my text messages a few months ago. And even when it comes to my text messages, I manually check my text messages about once or twice a day. I check them all at once rather than only checking, rather than getting a ping every second or every minute or whatever, and then checking it as it comes. So that's another way I'm taking back control of my focus. And so that is the premise of books like the books that Cal Newport wrote, Deep Focus, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World. And then he wrote an earlier book called So Good They Can't Ignore You, Why Skills Trump Passion in the Quest for Work You Love. Says, when it comes to the earlier book title, it is so blatantly classist and yeah. So it is so blatantly classist, and there are similar book titles that are popular especially among white people, right? Even when it's written by brown authors such as Robin Sharma, they're catering to a white audience, because that is the world, the system we live in. I could even say whitewash, but it's more than that. It's also like a foreign trauma response while trying to appease the oppressor, trying to adapt to the system and thriving within it, or even just surviving, rather than trying to dismantle the system, right? So this is even my own dilemma. How do you dismantle the system and simultaneously try to thrive in the system that you're trying to dismantle, right? So those are the questions that we will work on an anti-colonial perspective in this program, Akashic Creativity. So, book titles like The 5 a.m. Club, for example, kind of implies that people who don't wake up at 5 a.m. are, quote-unquote losers, and the 5 a.m. people are the winners. I don't wake up at 5 a.m. I wake up at 7 a.m. at the latest, because according to my work rhythm, I work better at night. I enjoy myself during the day, especially with my dance, and even my dance is kind of my creative expression as well as one of many. And I do more things that are more in the sense of work, such as video editing for my show Story Time, which is all about amplifying the lived experiences of us BIPOC. So when I read books by white authors, which I rarely do these days, or even by brown authors that seem to be very whitewashed, I read it with a grain of salt. I read it with an attempt to deconstruct the colonialism and also trying to understand where they want to be taking us. Because people believe in so-called conspiracy theories, but really, there's no need for a conspiracy theory. Because what they're doing is in plain sight. They're telling you what they're doing. Especially if you read these kinds of books, such as Deep Work by Cal Newport, or The 5 a.m. Club, or even the book Who Will Cry When You Die. Now, Who Will Cry When You Die, that seems like a nice title about legacy, and if you take it that way, that's fine. But it can also be a very classist thing about, again, being part of a rare elite, right? and they see this as a very smart thing also, right? Because it is a myth that people who create the most value are the richest people on earth, because they're the richest people, the billionaires, are actually the people who manipulate value rather than create value. They're the bankers and the stock traders who are not actually creating any real value but manipulating value by simply printing out money, printing out currency, and then crashing the economy every 10 years on purpose, uh, which makes everything available for cheap. And then because they have control of the money printing machines, they just print out new money to buy up all of this stuff on the cheap to make even more money. And then they sell it back to us at a higher price. So they're creating even more money. And then all the prices rise as a result, because they keep trying to raise the price as they become more and more successful, and then they crash the economy again, print out new money. So that is actually how systemically value is created. It's really important to understand that, and not buy into classist notions. So that's the main category of people who make the most amount of money in this world, or what I call currency, because there is a difference between money and currency, but I won't get into that today. Uh, Today I'm using the word money in a very colloquial, interchangeable way. So leaving that aside for a bit, the premise of a book like this, such as Deep Work by Cal Newport, he basically says that because of AI and robotics, and also simultaneously because social media is increasingly designed to distract us, to keep us addicted to it by playing with our cortisol and dopamine cycles, deliberately trying to trigger us and keep us there. We're living in a world where in the next 10 years, and yes, this is going to happen in 10 years or less, not even 20, there are going to be three types of people who will thrive. There are highly skilled people, especially programmers, who manage the machines, who manage the AI and the robotics, the capital owners who own those machines, and the third, which is the only option left to the rest of us, is to create deep value or high value by becoming very, very skilled in the things we create, whether it be paintings or art or inventions or whatever, or writing or novels or whatever it is that we create, to increase the ability to create something that makes a big impact. In order to create something that makes a big impact, you need to increase the capacity to focus, which is the premise of a book like Deep Work. But because it's written by white authors, and mainly for white people, white passing people, and white adjacent people, there are things majorly missing in a book like that, and hence why I am here to do this live. And yeah, so before I go further, I want to read from this book, The Body is Not an Apology, by Sonia Renee Taylor. This is the title of the book, The Body is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love. So today's story, normally in an Akashic storytelling episode, I would read a story, and if somebody comes up on the live, We talk about how that story might apply to their lives, how the story impacts them, what the Akasha has to say. Whereas today's reading is more for the collective, which I also do sometimes. Alright, this is from the prologue of the book. Long before there was a digital media and education company or a radical self-love movement, actually it's better, I think, if I just read it to you. With hundreds of thousands of followers on our website and social media pages, before anyone cared to write about us in newsprint or interview me on television, before people began to send me photos of their bodies with my words etched in ink on their backs, forearms, and shoulders, which never stops being awesome and weird, there was a word, well, words. Those words were, "Your body is not an apology." It was the summer of 2010 in a hotel room in Knoxville, Tennessee. My team and I were preparing for evening bouts and competition on the Southern Fried Poetry Slam. Slam is competitive performance poetry. Teams and individuals get 3 minutes on stage to share what is often deeply intimate, personal, and political poetry. At which point 5 randomly selected judges from the audience score their poems on a scale from 0 to 10. It's a raucous game that takes the high art of poetry and brings it to the masses in bars, clubs, coffee shops, and National Poetry Slam championship tournaments around the country. Poetry Slam is as ridiculous as it is beautiful. It is everything gauche and glorious about the power of the word. The slam is a place where the misfit and the marginalized and the self-absorbed have center stage in the rapt ears of an audience, if only for 3 minutes. It was on a hotel bed in this city, preparing for this odd game, that I uttered the words, "Your body is not an apology," for the first time. My team was a kaleidoscope of bodies and identities. We were a microcosm of a world I would like to live in. We were black, white, Southeast Asian. We are able-bodied and disabled. We were gay, straight, bi, and queer. What we brought to Knoxville that year were the stories of living in our bodies, in all their complex tapestries. We were complicated and honest with each other, and this is how I wound up in a conversation with my teammate Natasha, an early 30-something living with cerebral palsy and fearful she might be pregnant. Natasha told me how her potential pregnancy was most assuredly by a guy who was just an occasional swing. All of life was up in the air for Natasha, but she was abundantly clear that she had no desire to have a baby, and not by this person. One of my many career iterations of the past was as a sexual health and public health service provider. This background made me notorious for asking people about their safer sex practices, handing out condoms and offering sexual health harm reduction strategies. Instinctually, I asked Natasha why she had chosen not to use a condom with this casual sexual partner with whom she had no interest in procreating. Neither Natasha nor I knew that my honest question and her honest answer would be the catalyst for a movement. Natasha told me her truth. My disability makes that sex hard already, with positioning and stuff. I just didn't feel like it was okay to make a big deal about using condoms when we hear someone's truth and it strikes some deep part of our humanity, our own hidden shames. it can be easy to recoil into silence. We struggle to hold the truths of others because we have so rarely had the experience of having our own truths held. Social researcher and expert on vulnerability and shame, Brené Brown says, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. I understood the truth Natasha was sharing. Her words pricked some deep, painful underbelly of knowing in my own body. My entire being rang in resonance. I was transported to all the times I had given away my own body in penance. In penance. A reel of memories scrolled through my mind of all the ways I told the world I was sorry for having this wrong, bad body. It was from this deep cave of mutual vulnerability that the words spilled from me. Natasha, your body is not an apology. Your body is not an apology. It is not something you give to someone to say, sorry for my disability. She began to weep. And for a few minutes, I just held my maybe pregnant friend as she contemplated the fullness of what those words meant for her life and her body. There are times when our unflinching honesty, vulnerability, and empathy will create a transformative portal, and opening to a completely new way of being, of living. Such a portal was created between Natasha and me that summer evening in Tennessee, because as the words escaped my lips, some part of them remained stuck inside me. The words I said to Natasha in that hotel room were as much for me as they were for her. I was also telling myself, Sonia, your body is not an apology. At every turn for days after my conversation with Natasha, the words returned to me like some sort of cosmic boomerang. They kept echoing off the walls of my hidden hurts. Every time I uttered a disparaging word about my dimpled thighs, I'd hear, your body is not an apology, Sonia. Each time I marked some erroneous statement with, my bad, I'm so stupid, my own inner voice would retort, your body is not an apology. Whenever my critical eye focused laser-like on some perceived imperfection of my own or some other human being's, the words would arrive like a well-trained butler to remind me, hey, the body is not an apology. My poet self knew that the words were demanding to be more than that, a passing conversation with a friend. They wanted more than my own self-flagellation. The words always had their own plans. Me, I was just a vessel. Hi, Jonathan. You might have to watch the replay because I just finished reading the story. Anyways, so after reading that, I was really moved to tears because I have my own issues with body image and body love. Since I have birth trauma and I was born feet first, and the nurse was neglectful and just pulled it and twisted my feet and my spine, and I needed at least 2 operations to fix it. And the neglect has a lot to do with racism and colorism against my parents as well, because this was a racist, colorist country. This was Myanmar, and we were darker skinned Indians. And yeah, so all my life I wanted my twisted, crooked body to be straight until I started dancing, especially with my spiral stick, and reclaiming my pleasure and my joy. But when I read the story, it really connected all the dots for me, and I realized that, well, first of all, even before this realization, I realized that my dance, the way I dance with that spiral stick that I showed you earlier, must be unique because a few days ago, that stick, which I've had for 3 years, which I found on the road, and I knew it was going to be an important part of my life, it kind of cracked and almost broke, and I quickly got it stuck back together with super glue or Gorilla Glue. And by the way, there's a Japanese term called kintsugi, which is about uh, when something cracks, they actually inlay it with gold and celebrate it. They don't consider it to be broken. And that's kind of how I see my spiral stick too now. As a side note, they have a similar concept called wabi sabi as well, which is a very, very deep idea. But the surface translation is something like the beauty of imperfection. And yeah, and speaking of imperfection, as people of color, as indigenous people, as black and brown people, white people tend to put us in a false demonization, exotification binary, so we're not allowed to have flaws, to make mistakes, to be imperfect. So all of this plays into that moment when that stick cracked. And while the glue dried up, I got scared a little and I tried to look up replacements online, and I couldn't find any. Like even the object that I use for this unique dance doesn't exist. There's no object like this in the world, as far as I know. I just couldn't find any. So there's no replacement for this stick, even when it comes to the physical object. And there's no replacement for me either. And there's no replacement for my dance, for the way I dance with that stick. The closest thing might be the Sufi dervishes who dance in slow circles, but it's not at all like that either. And so when I read the story, the final dot connected for me that I'm able to dance in that spiral way because of the unique body that I have. It's partly because my body is twisted and crooked. That it makes it easier for me to dance in those spiral patterns. Then quite possibly if somebody else picked up that stick, they probably couldn't do it. Because that stick is literally uh, attuned to me, it's aligned to me, it's entangled with me, if you're going to use a quantum physics term. Uh, there's a micro wormhole created with me in that stick, with me in that dance. It's one. And yeah, and Sonia Renee Taylor talks about how we need more than self-confidence, more than self-esteem, more than self-acceptance. We need a radical self-love. And I agree. And in fact, I think we need a radical self-celebration. I celebrate my body. I more than accept it at this point. And that joy is important. The, the problematic things about books like this, even though there are useful things in there, is the classicism and the ableism that sucks the joy out of it, where they take themselves way too seriously, where focus is somehow this serious thing, when it doesn't have to be. In fact, it's a lot more enjoyable when you put joy and freedom and love and pleasure and the erotic into it, where focus doesn't have to give you FOMO or a fear of missing out, where it can come from a boundless space, a boundless joy, a boundless pleasure, and all of that boundless energy used to bring in powerful focus, like the energy of the sun used to focus on a magnifying glass that can even burn paper. Hi, Abby. So it's super focused, but the sun still remains the sun. The sun is still big and huge. It's like, 20 or 30 Earths combined is the power of the sun. It's boundless. It's the closest thing we know of to what it's like to feel boundless, which is why, in many cultures, including my culture, we do kind of worship the sun. We have so much reverence for the sun. And in fact, in my meditations and visions and, the Akasha, my own Akashic records kind of guided me to make this painting that kind of represents what we're talking about, where there's a singular focus, but it's made from concentric circles of simultaneously boundlessness and simultaneously focused. This is a boundless focus where you don't lose that spaciousness, you don't lose that joy and pleasure when you're focused on a task, on a creative task for your creative expression. And it's so imperative, especially for us Black, Brown, Indigenous people, to come from that place of joy in order to make that deep impact, in order to create creative expressions and works of art, that it comes from that boundless joy. And that's why I'm including that in my upcoming program, Akashic Creativity, reclaiming joy. So the first week we're going to go into amplifying clarity. The second week we're going to go into validating your value. And the third week is when we're going to reclaiming your joy. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. So be sure to DM me about the program Akashic. Oh, it paused. Be sure to DM me about my upcoming program Akashic Creativity. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.